Welcome to Dialogue. The climate in Alaska is cold, but the face-to-face meeting of top China and U.S. diplomats heated up in an unusual opening, as each accused the other of breaking protocol in a bout of contentious verbal sparring. So how can this meeting help both countries understand each other better? And can vital cooperation be found despite many ongoing disagreements? For a deeper look at China-U.S. relations, I'm joined by Dr. Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Dr. Jorge Heine, a Research Professor at the Pardee School of Global Studies of Boston University, and Martin CF, Senior Fellow at American University in Moscow. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, let's start with Ambassador in Boston, Heine here. It's a rocky start, rather unusual, as many people have described it. Rarely seen in this high-level discussions. So tell us, as an ambassador, as a senior diplomat, you are familiar with these kind of discussions, negotiation. What a pre-negotiation media briefing protocol looks like.
Well, the whole idea, it seems to me here, is that the meeting is actually taking place. This is the first meeting of the foreign ministers, Secretary of State of both countries, and National Security Advisor and Mr. Yang Jiechi. And in that sense, it is extremely important. I know it's gotten off to a rocky start, but the main thing that it is taking place. I understand the conversations went on for much longer than they were expected to. And in that sense, it seems to me, it marks an important beginning. The Biden administration is still just coming in. It's finding its feet. The relationship with China is obviously the key foreign policy issue it faces. So it seems to me here we have to keep in mind that the main thing is that this is taking place. The conversation started. And hopefully that will lead to some significant developments.
It's not as bad as probably a lot of people see. So Dr. Zhao over there, this is the first round of talks. Chinese top diplomat Yang Jiechi responded to the U.S. opening remarks, saying, I think we thought too well of you. We thought the U.S. would follow the necessary diplomatic protocols. In front of the Chinese side, the U.S. side is not qualified to speak to China from a position of strength. So what's your take on this, from a diplomatic and a negotiation tactics perspective?
Well, I think that shows how Director Yang is really surprised by American side because, if you think about this meeting, the location and the timing both were decided by American side, and China agreed to come to Alaska to meet the top officials from the United States. So from that perspective, that means that the U.S. Is the host here, and they should show China respect. However, they didn't, and that's why I think Director Yang Jiechi responded to American opening remarks very strongly. And also following that, Yang Jiechi also pointed out that Americans made pre-meeting arrangement by having Quad summit and also having 2+2 meetings with its allies in the region like Japan and South Korea. And because of that, they wanted to speak to China from the so-called position of strength, which means that they thought they could have a collective pressure on China to force China to make some concessions, or maybe forcing China to accept some positions from the U.S. side. And China definitely will not accept this kind of position and refuse to make any concessions under this pressure. And I think Director Yang made that very clear from the very beginning of this meeting.
Well, Martin, obviously for the Chinese side, people feel kind of, unhappy because of these condescending attitudes from their U.S. counterpart, let's say. U.S. talked about, they are speaking from a position of strength. But for the Chinese side, they would say, you are disqualified in terms of position of strength. If you look at China, the containment of the virus, the economic recovery, and if you look ahead and the vaccine development, global goods, and also 2035 5-year plan, etc. What do you make of that?
I think you make a very important point, and that is the American side is still playing in, as the ambassador said, they're finding their feet, but they are thinking in terms of the past, not the present. You must remember, President Biden is 78 years old. He was for 8 years Vice President of the United States under Obama. For 36 years before that, he was one of the longest-serving senators in U.S. history. He first entered the Senate in 78. Now, actually 30 years in the Senate. Now, this is very important because he is at an age when it is not easy for people to change their perspectives even when they want to. And we see the same situation with Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. They both held deputy positions just below the levels they are currently at for most years of the Obama administration. So these are three men, the three top policymakers, are all living in the past. They are not looking on China as it is. They are looking in terms of their own assumptions, which were not even true then, of 10 or even 30 years ago. And this is very unsettling. This is very negative.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ambassador, as you said, these two countries are very important in the sense they are most powerful countries in the world. They need to work together and to find a middle ground to cooperate for the sake of not only the two countries, but also the whole world. So Ambassador here, when they talk about the rules-based international order, but they disagree, right? The U.S. is talking about basically its rules, usually at least. The Chinese side is talking about UN-centered, rules and also systems over there.
Well, I would say the following.
Exactly.
The moment we are talking about rules, it seems to me, we are making progress. Until a few months ago, the message that was coming out of Washington was that there were no rules. And it was all, spur of the moment, improvising, ad hoc measures. It seems to me we're making progress. We're all better off if we do have a rule-based international system. Now, the United States and China ought to be able to agree on which those rules are. And what the Biden administration has been saying is they will embrace multilateralism. China has been embracing multilateralism for a long time as well. So I see a lot of room for convergence here. It seems to me we have to look beneath these initial skirmishes and look forward. And in that sense, despite everything that has happened, I think we are better off right now than we were a few months ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ambassador, you mentioned this multilateralism. I think it's a good point. Also, President Biden talked about that. There's a lot of room for the two countries to work together, for example, under WTO. Let's do something to revive the WTO system and also WHO. During this pandemic crisis, what we need the most should be the top priority right now. The two countries work together on vaccination, distribution, production, and help the rest of the world. Climate change, not to mention that, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the point is the following. It seems to me there's enormous room for cooperation on, the so-called global challenges that you just mentioned. Climate change, pandemics, there might be other sort of financial crisis in the future. All of these will need the cooperation of the United States and China. Between China and the United States, they make up 40% of the world GDP. Whatever these global challenges are, if the United States and China agree on them, they will be able to move forward. If they don't, we'll be in serious difficulties. So in that sense, it seems to me, there's a lot of room there for cooperation. At the same time, it would be foolish to not to recognize that there are significant differences, and they must be confronted as well and try to make some headway on them.
Well, Martin, the point made by the ambassador is really, it's worthwhile, it's important, it's vital for the two countries of the whole world to come together to work. But what we, hear from Washington often is really about, decoupling the two countries' economy, technology, and then sanctions, on the Chinese companies or individuals. And also, it's about more competition, if not confrontation. Do you think Washington is, I would use the word like sincere in looking for cooperation with the Chinese side and multilateralism, let's say?
Unfortunately, I do not. And this comes as a surprise to me because, again, as the ambassador has pointed out quite correctly, the world needs U.S.-Chinese cooperation, and the world prospers and has prospered from generations of U.S.-China cooperation. And the individuals we see now running the U.S. have been champions of such cooperation in the past. But the attitudes in Washington have fundamentally changed in the last few years. President Trump and his people and Secretary of State Pompeo succeeded far more profoundly than I think people outside the U.S. realize in changing strategic attitudes in Washington. Unfortunately, there is a deeply, widely held prejudice among policymakers, not just in the military, but in diplomatic areas and economic areas as well, that they see China as a competitor rather than a partner. And this is a radical change from several years ago. It is a radical change even from the Obama administration. And the key issue is, will President Biden have the force of personality and conviction to turn the clock back in a positive way? Can he roll back attitudes of suspicion and xenophobia? And so far, he does not appear to wish to. He appears to be preferring to follow short-term political advantage in Washington, going along with the consensus he inherited, rather than rolling it back and confronting it, which he needs to do.
Well, Zhao Hai, the problem is like if you look at what blocks or prevents the two countries from coming together or cooperation, partly is the Chinese domestic issues. For example, frankly speaking, the U.S. has been lecturing the Chinese side for many, many years. One thing is during this opening talks, it's about democracy. Director Yang mentioned that if you speak of democracy or the political system, the Chinese system actually has worked very well over the past 40 plus years, if not one of the most successful the systems in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in this meeting, this is really China wanted to talk to the U.S. side peer to peer. It's not that the U.S. is no longer in the position of lecturing China on China's domestic issues, let alone interfering in China's domestic issues. So in this respect, that's why I think Chinese side are very surprised that very experienced diplomats like Secretary of State Blinken and also National Security Advisor Sullivan, at this juncture, particularly at the beginning, when the media are all present, started talking about these issues and blaming China and lecturing China. That's why Director Yang must fight back and tell them that China's system has been widely supported by the population. And also, so far, China has developed its own political system that is leading economic development successfully in the past 3-4 decades. So this is why, again, the U.S. is in no position to talk to China from so-called strengths. Again, they are actually trying, the U.S. by itself cannot no longer talk to China from the so-called position of strengths. That's why they are calling all their allies to come together to coordinate their policy and giving pressure to China. But in that respect, I think in order to do that, they create a lot of information because on certain issues they cannot unite together, because the truth is that many issues are not like what the U.S. described, not like the mainstream media described, like the issue of Xinjiang, of Hong Kong, or Taiwan. So I think the number one issue right now between the two countries is how to overcome right now this very difficulties of understand each other's positions and intentions and strategic visions for the future.
Well, you mentioned about this actually so-called manufacturing of consensus over there, for example, on Xinjiang. Any serious thinkers, any serious scholars would question the lack of evidence and those accusations against the Chinese side. And this time around, Director Yang mentioned directly about the U.S. human rights record. For example, BLM movement over there. There's far from being perfect, let's say, and also the rising anti-Asian discrimination or attacks on Asian people. U.S. obviously faces a lot of human rights problems. They need to focus on that before probably pointing a finger at other countries. And somehow they are making the human rights issue as one of the barriers between the two countries for their cooperation. Is that the situation, Zhao Hai?
Yeah, I think if they want to talk about human rights, that's fine, because many issues, actually China and the United States are both party of a more broader definition of human rights. That's why I think neither countries are perfect. So that's why China has the right to point out the shortcomings of Americans in terms of their race relations, in terms of the most recent xenophobia, like what happened in Atlanta just a few days ago. And all those issues are not perfectly resolved, like Secretary of State Blinken said. And they show their hubris and double standards against China. Because if the U.S. is improving on their own human rights record, why couldn't the U.S. recognize that China is also improving our human rights records very, very quickly? And particularly in terms of Xinjiang, we've explained many times. The fact is that people living in Xinjiang, their economic welfare, their political rights, and also the China's resolve of the problem of extremism are improving very quickly. So I think in that respect, China demands that international community recognize the progress on the Chinese side, and China refuse to be lectured on those particular issues.
Well, Martin, do you see there's a possibility somehow the two countries can put aside for example, the lecturing of each other about their domestic challenges? The U.S. stopping blaming China or pointing finger at China on Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, or of course the Chinese side, they have followed principle of non-interference of internal affairs. If not prompted by the U.S. side, I believe Director Yang will never talk about the U.S. domestic issues over there. But how likely is it, for the both sides, let's not to interfere into each other's domestic affair. Let's focus on cooperation.
I think you're absolutely right. I think this is the message Beijing wants to put out. I do believe it's the message Director Yan wanted to give, and no doubt privately gave very strongly to Secretary of State Blinken. But I think, again, as the other speakers have pointed out, the Chinese side was understandably surprised at the aggressive public pre-meeting stance taken by the U.S. And therefore, Dr. Yan had no choice but to respond strongly to defend his country's position. And it was the U.S. that initiated this confrontation. There is plenty of room for cooperation, and I agree with the ambassador very strongly. The best sign that came out of this meeting is that privately they spoke so long. When you have nothing to say, meetings break up fast. When there is room for discussion, when there is room to get a point across to the other side and for both sides to wrestle with real issues, when they both seek understanding and progress, that is when the talks appear to be most difficult, when they have to take a long period of time. The ambassador, with his vast experience, points out this vital point. So I agree with him. The most hopeful sign from this meeting is that the private talks went on much longer than they were expected to do. This is a very positive sign. And there is certainly room for progress. The U.S. has plenty of room to maneuver.
Yeah, Ambassador, in recent strategies and documents issued by the Biden administration, we can see some people would say, describe, there is the sense of anxiety of the American political elites, like somehow China is catching up quickly. China is approaching,
Yes,
closely,
exactly.
very close to us, closer and closer. One day probably will even replace our number one position in the world. I mean, how should China do, or how can the two countries interact with each other under such rising anxiety and tension and even fear?
Yes. No, well, there are two things here. One of them is there is obviously, there is a competition for primacy in world affairs. And this is how this works in international relations. There isn't much that can be done about it. It's in the nature of things. And the established power, the hegemon today, the United States, sees itself
Exactly.
under some sort of threat by a rising power that is China. That is par for the course. Now, the question is, it seems to me, how do we de-escalate this tension, this spat that has emerged, so that it doesn't get worse? Because it seems to me what we have seen over the past couple of years is a steady downhill course of this relationship. And given the fact, as I said earlier, that both of them represent 40% of the world GDP,
Exactly.
there's much too much at stake. I mean, if we look at the global challenges, again, climate change, the pandemics, other crises that are erupting around the world, either we hang together or we'll hang separately. So it seems to me the message to that anxiety that is only not just in U.S. political elites, also among the public, among U.S. public opinion, is to say, this is we live in one world. Perhaps the message should be, it is perfectly possible to have one world and two systems and make the most of it.
Well put, one world, two systems.
Exactly.
And of course, that requires we respect each other, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, etc. And you mentioned about the de-escalation. I
Exactly.
think a lot of people are looking forward to any signs of de-escalation of tensions between the two most powerful countries. But also remember, over the past 4 years, we can say mostly it's Washington. Remember which side first started this, this economic war, let's say, tariff war by Trump administration, and also the restrictions on the visas of scholars or of the journalists, the media war between the two countries. It's mostly really started by Washington. Shouldn't they talk about those issues? Let's say, let's roll back all those tariffs. How about that? Is that possible, Ambassador?
I agree.
Well, I would put it this way. It doesn't make much sense to fall now into the blame game of who started what and who didn't do that. That, it seems to me, is not the way forward. It's a bit like in a marriage when the spouses start blaming each other for who started the spat. The point is to move forward. And I would suggest that it would be important to pick one contentious issue that perhaps could be solved, or at least semblance of an agreement could be reached. Among those most contentious issues, I would argue that, for example, the issue of Taiwan should be identified and said, okay, let us put a stop to these differences that have emerged. Taiwan at some point will be dealt with, but for now, let us lower the temperature and not keep increasing the differences and the contentious natures of our disagreements on Taiwan. If that happens, there might be room for moving also on other issues.
Well, Dr. Zhao, many people are looking at the possibility of normalize again, or bring back this relationship back on track. For example, exchange of scholars, exchange of students, and also reopening of the consulates in Houston and Chengdu bilaterally. Shouldn't that be the priority of the two sides, to normalize the relationship and at the same time focus on their differences to resolve that?
First of all, I want to say that all those solutions are all there. And it's not that difficult to restore, repair some of the damaged relationship between the two sides. The only barrier that I see right now is U.S. domestic politics. And I think it's understandably that right now the Biden administration continue to insist on their strategic patience and to continue to say that they're reviewing their China policy, things has to wait, and setting so-called many preconditions for improving China relations or to turn this relation back to on a more normal basis. So I think we can all understand, from the last election, even though Trump administration is now gone from the White House. However, I think the nationalist and the populist pressure is still very much on the Biden administration, so that it leaves a very limited maneuverability room for the current administration to move forward with a better and improved relations with China.
Well, it's a sort of like a related question, Martin, I have for you. U.S. official Kurt Campbell said earlier before the discussion, before the negotiation, that any improvement in U.S.-China relationship would require Beijing resolving its disputes with Australia. What do you make of that?
Again, I think this is a classic example of what they say in America. I think you know the phrase very well, passing the buck. He is ducking responsibility. The blame is being put on China. You must settle with Australia before we will condescend to talk with you. That is not the constructive approach to take. I fully agree with both the previous speakers. First, that the issues can and should be resolved. The real barrier is indeed domestic affairs. And really, they should not be. We tend to forget that President Biden won the election decisively. He won the election with 7 million more votes than former President Trump received. More Americans voted for Joe Biden as president than for any other political candidate in U.S. history. This gives the president a great deal of moral force. He also won on the basis of ending the era of bad feelings and confrontation that Trump was rightly recognized as having stirred up. Biden has much more maneuverability, I think, than he may realize or than he dares to take. The problem is he has been a lifelong senator. He really was not like a governor who is a leader on a smaller scale in the U.S. system. In the Senate, the emphasis is always on domestic politics and avoiding confrontation. Biden is going for confrontation with China in order to avoid confrontation with his Republican critics in the U.S. This is exactly the wrong priority he should be taking. It's very bad.
Well, Ambassador, you are based in the U.S. Obviously, you observe the U.S. politics. Despite the success of the election of President Biden, obviously there's a lot of pressure from the Republicans. And also, if you look ahead, there's upcoming midterm election for the Congress. And so somehow, if you take a look at the tough rhetoric from the Biden team, somehow they are also targeting at the domestic audience. How big a factor is that, the pressure from their opponents?
No, it is very big. And there are two things here. One of them, the Republicans are competing to be the toughest on China, and Democrats don't go behind. And public opinion has also shown that position gets a lot of support across the United States. So it is not easy for President Biden to go, sort of against the wind, as it were. And that is why it seems to me we should look at some sort of low-hanging fruit and try to solve a couple of issues. If we move ahead on that, it seems to me progress might be made. If I observe the negotiations between China and the United States, you will realize that China is very keen to talk big picture, the overall framework, the situation of the world. The United States officials, on the other hand, are much more concrete and specific and empirical. They select particular issues. And that is why it seems to me, if a couple of issues could be identified on which progress could be made and some, at least, tentative solution could be reached, then we would be making progress.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, that's it for this edition of Dialogue. I'm Xu Jingduo. Thank you for watching and see you next time.